So Siobhan, do you want to just start by talking a bit about your background and your role at Textile Exchange?
Of course, sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks for inviting me to speak, Beth. So I joined Textile Exchange about 5 months ago now, because really we're starting to think about how we can better incorporate human rights. Like Beth said, there's this whole other body of work on the other side of environmental, but it's so integrated that we kind of can't separate them any longer. Before Textile Exchange, I spent 9 years working in apparel brands here in the UK, but they have multinational supply chains very similar to all the outdoor brands. So supply chains don't actually look that different once you dig into them in our industry.
Exactly. Okay, very good. And maybe just even a bit about how you got into this field. I think that's always interesting for the students to hear about as well before we dive into the content.
Sure. So actually, I studied the environmental side, which maybe Beth, you don't know.
Yeah, no, I don't think I was aware of that, actually. That's great.
So I studied environmental policy and economics, and then I joined Burberry, so a big brand here in London. They have huge supply chains across the world, and I joined their responsibility team. So I've always worked in these kind of responsibility or sustainability teams, whatever you call them, and really just mainly traveling around to factories, working with local teams, which is something that's really important, especially on the social side, I think, getting that local context. So it's basically been about ensuring that everyone is treated fairly in the supply chains, digging deeper, getting that traceability that we need to get to ensure people are being treated fairly. And then I moved on to Stella McCartney. So again, similar supply chains, Asian-based, European-based, doing the same kind of thing.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, so, and I know you've put together just a few slides to talk to some of the key issues, and we'll just have kind of an informal dialogue here to give everyone just, again, at least an overview of some of the key topics. And as always, we want to keep this quite practical. So I think you'll all have heard this already as a theme for me coming through this course, is really making sure that you all can see how these things are really playing out and being applied in the business context today. So have at it, Siobhan.
So I really wanted to start just by, there are all these terms: labor rights, human rights, decent work, ethical trade, resilient livelihoods, but whatever you call it, it all comes down to the same thing. It's what people want, what people need in their lives, what workers want. What Beth and I need from our jobs is very similar to what the workers in the supply chains need. So Rosie Hurst is a close colleague I've worked with for a long time. She runs a great ethical trading human rights consultancy here in the UK, but across the world. And I think she sums it up really well. There are just three things that really we're looking for in our work life. And one of them is fair pay. So we're not just talking about the amount of money you're paid. We're talking about making sure that you know that next month you're still going to be paid. You know how much you're going to be paid. You know you can support your family. You can meet your costs. That's all really important. Making sure you have that job security is really key. Respect. I think probably everyone understands this, whether you're working or not. Everyone wants to be respected. They want recognition for what they do. They want to feel that they're heard, that they can speak out, that they can raise concerns. So that's the same, again, in any supply chain. And the third thing is probably something that resonates with everyone. It's about your family, your community. You want to build a better future. People always want to build a better world for their children, whether it's their children, other siblings, etc., etc. That's something that everyone wants from their job and their opportunities in the future. So just whenever you're thinking about any of these things, just think about yourself and how you would feel in this situation, because that is basically all we're doing on the social side, is thinking about how we would feel. I wanted to take us back a little bit because this is not a new concept. Firstly, it definitely didn't start in the 1990s. There have been global supply chains hundreds, thousands of years, but this in the last kind of couple of decades has really become key to brand strategies, key to brand sustainability strategies. They're not just looking at the environmental side and actually many of them started by looking on the social side because of the concerns that were hitting the press. So in the 1990s, there was a huge one. There was this photo was printed in Life magazine. There's actually reports that this was a staged photo because actually they don't ship footballs fully inflated like this. So not necessarily a true picture of the supply chain, but what it did was act as a catalyst. People started caring about where their products were coming from, their sports products, apparel and footwear supply chains, and it really drove the start of these kind of ethical trading programs as we now know them. So in the 2000s as well, there was this like increasing consumer understanding of what was going on in the supply chain. They were demanding more transparency from the brands that they love. They wanted to know where things were coming from. They felt, a certain sense of guilt. You don't want to feel like your favorite jacket is coming from somewhere where a child's been working. So the pressure was increasing more and more. So many of the brands that we know and love have big teams now working on ensuring that they have these code of conducts in place, which I'll come on to in a minute, and having these audit programs which check the conditions in the factories and further down the supply chain. And then another big turning point was in 2013, which I'm not sure if you'll remember, but it was certainly, if you worked in the industry, it was a big moment. It was a terrifying moment where Rana Plaza is a building in Dhaka in Bangladesh, where lots of brands were working. They didn't necessarily know they were working there because one of the big issues is traceability of our products, which I'm sure you talk about elsewhere in the course. But people, brands didn't realize that their products were being made there because work is often subcontracted from factory to factory. So Rana Plaza collapsed. There were 5 factories inside it. Over 1,000 workers died, many of them women. 70% of workers in fashion supply chains, apparel and footwear supply chains are women, so are always more heavily impacted. So yeah, 1,000 people died just while they, on a normal day at work. So this really was a wake-up moment. It drove a lot of collaboration between brands before. Often, like, this is quite a private topic. Brands don't often share the human rights abuses they found in their supply chain. It's not an easy thing to talk about. But this really started to drive industry collaboration and the realization that we can do this if we work together much better than working separately.
Yeah, and one thing I would just interject, Siobhan, is I did have them watch The True Cost prior to their
documentary.
The documentary, which was now created in 2015, I believe, but it's still, it's all still relevant. Just even in my rewatching of it prior to this course, it's just fascinating how all of the messages are completely relevant today. And just the other note as well, again, all of these supply chain, it's the global apparel and footwear industry. It's not fashion versus outdoor versus athletic versus home textiles. It's all being made in the same supply chains and the same factories. Now Rana Plaza in particular was certainly some of the lower end products on the market, I would say, because those are the ones that are really driving to that low, very lowest, amount to pay workers in a way that outdoor and luxury fashion, for example, don't necessarily do that to that same extent. However, all of these issues are still completely relevant, obviously, with our industry sectors working all around the world and the interconnectivity of supply chains. So just want to provide a bit of framing on that as well.
Yeah, and I think something as well Rana Plaza highlighted was kind of the lack of enforcement of regulation within certain huge export producing countries. So that's something that really drove brands to focus on that as well, and that kind of pushed the governments to better enforce regulation that might have already been existing. There was already fire regulation there, but it wasn't correctly implemented. Which kind of brings me on to the legislation piece. So in 2011 was kind of the first time we had some real guidance from an institution on what's our responsibility as a brand. Sorry, I'm going to speak a lot from a brand perspective. That's my background anyway.
I think that's great. Actually, that's perfect. Yeah, I think that's great. It's the perfect context for, again, how do these issues get applied when someone like you is in this role at a brand and having to deal with that and understand how to manage that in the context of running a business. So I think that's perfect.
Sure. So I'm going to come back to the UN Guiding Principles, but the UN founded them. Professor John Ruggie, they're sometimes called the Ruggie Principles. And they're really about the state has a responsibility to protect, and corporates have a responsibility to respect. And then everyone has a responsibility to make sure grievances can be heard. So we'll come back to those in a minute. But really, those are the basis of a lot of the legislation, regulation that's coming out now around due diligence and brands' responsibilities in this area. So following 2011, 2012, 2015, we had our first kind of reporting requirements. So the California Transparency Act, the UK Modern Slavery Act, more recently the Australian one. These are all requirements for businesses, not necessarily to act. So businesses have to write a statement annually about all the actions they're taking in the supply chain to protect and respect workers. But ultimately, a business could write a statement saying they don't think they have any slavery in their supply chain, so they haven't taken any actions. Obviously, there's a reputational piece there where businesses generally don't want to do that, but I've seen some pretty awful statements. But more recently, there's a big push on holding companies to account. So the France Corporate Duty of Vigilance law was really the first one in this area. And coming through now, we have the European EU Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. Both of these relate to environment as well. So maybe you'll cover them in another section of the course. But to give you an example, the France Corporate Duty of Vigilance law, the first lawsuit that was brought against Total in 2019. So Total is the big oil company, and civil society actors were basically able to hold, or it's still going through the court, but they're aiming to hold Total to account for the environmental and human rights abuses associated with a mining project in Uganda. So these kind of laws are really changing the way companies have to operate, because they're being held to account in France for something that they may or may not have done in Uganda. So this is why right now the EU Due Diligence Directive is being looked at really closely, because this will ultimately create so much more responsibility for businesses that previously has been more reputational based rather than legal. So I just wanted to touch on that because it's changing quite quickly now. So these are the UN Guiding Principles: protect, respect, remedy. And so these are the basis of these new due diligence acts coming through. Are you going to say something there?
Oh, did you have I'm not sure if the slide advanced to the UN Guiding Principles, unless.
Oh, you can't see it?
No, not yet. We're still on the timeline of legislation. There you go. Perfect.
Okay, we did it. Yep. So yes, as I said, the state has a duty to protect human rights. So that means essentially that the state needs to put the laws in place to protect people in their country's human rights. It also has to protect any workers coming into the country, and it's also about enforcement. So these kind of are self-explanatory. The main focus, I think, of the UN Guiding Principles for us is about what it means for corporates. So the UN has said that as a brand, we have the responsibility to respect all the people in our supply chain. So that seems obvious, but it doesn't only include harm that we directly cause. So it's also indirect harm. So it could be really far down in your cotton supply chain at the farm level, where someone is being harassed or abused or anything like that, not receiving their fair wages, and that is still a brand's responsibility. So this is basically the basis of all the new legislation coming through, but it's a really hard thing for companies to do. It's maybe slightly easier in your finished goods factories, your final customers, the people you're paying, but further down the supply chain, it's really difficult. And additional to that, we also have we have to provide access to remedy for people. So we need to be able to hear from people really far down in our supply chains, anywhere where there's harm that's related to any of our products. Because again, even if we didn't cause that, it's still related to our products, so we still have a responsibility. And that's really the difference that has come through all these the latest regulation coming through.
Yeah, and I would just sort of restate that as well, that point about what is the legal duty of a company. This is a really crux issue that's coming up in a lot of the, as Siobhan said, in a lot of the legislation that's being proposed, particularly around social labor rights. There was a piece of legislation in California that was being introduced a few months ago as well, and this is one of the key just reasons that there were some companies that didn't support it, not because they were saying at all that we don't think that that businesses should have some responsibility to the workers that are in their supply chain. The challenge is when you get, as Siobhan said, 3 or 4 steps removed from the actual contract that you as a company have in place with a supplier, that becomes really challenging in terms of enforcement, in terms of management, in terms of all of those things from a business perspective. So it's really the sort of that sort of enforcement mechanism challenge. And I don't want to be naive. I mean, I'm sure there are some companies who are pointing to that and saying, well, that's just unrealistic for us to do. So, because it's a lot, right? But there are other companies I know who genuinely, are committed to best practices around, the opportunities for their workers and their supply chain. And even those companies were saying, this is going to be extremely challenging from a legal perspective to implement for our business, because we don't actually hold that contract with that subcontractor farther down the supply chain. So just one sort of interesting nuance or thing to think about as you might see some of these pieces of policy start to come out, as well as what's the enforcement mechanism that's being asked, and is that realistic in terms of the reality of what the supply chain looks like today, and also just how business gets done, frankly, and where the liability lies, and how can we continue to push for the very best practices for workers in our supply chain in ways that work within the realities of the business structure that we have to work in. So
completely. This leverage is decreasing down the supply chain, but it's also, we can't all be a huge brand with massive orders. And so many companies internally are taking a human rights due diligence approach, which is really about prioritizing. It's about looking at the severity of the issue, the frequency of that issue, even if you don't have that data from your supply chain, using publicly available data, and figuring out like which battles you need to focus on, essentially, because it gets really tricky further down the supply chain, also in certain countries where you're limited in your actions as an organization. So yeah, it's not that easy to resolve all these issues.
Yeah, exactly. And the point you made about not every company is a large multinational, multi-billion-dollar business is particularly relevant, I think, for athletic and outdoor as well. There are a lot of smaller outdoor brands in particular, who, won't have the same leverage, won't have the buying power in a lot of these factories. And so that's something we'll also talk about when we get to environmental impacts at the facility level as well, which will be a future module. But it's a key sort of challenge to keep in mind, because even for the large companies, their leverage decreases, as you said, as you go farther back in the supply chain, because you just get farther away from the actual contract that you have. So anyway.
And that's where you kind of come back to the Rana Plaza situation and look
Yes.
at how you can work together and increase your leverage together.
Yes. Great.
Can you see the next slide?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So I just wanted to touch on what a code of conduct looks like, in case you guys haven't seen it. This is taken from the Ethical Trading Initiative, which is a multi-stakeholder initiative in the UK, but very similar to that of the Fair Labor Association in the US. There's Fair Wear Foundation in Europe as well. Lots of these multi-stakeholder initiatives have brands as members, and they essentially support them, guide them on what policies they should have in place and how they should accomplish those. But so I just wanted to touch on a few of these areas, maybe not all of them, but generally a code of conduct will have these kind of 9 principles. Employment is freely chosen is about forced labor, slave labor, and bonded labor. We'll come into it in a bit more detail, but there's kind of a spectrum of modern slavery, they say, and it's about choice, it's about who has the control, but this is a big focus for many organizations right now. Child labor, maybe I'll skip over. It's quite an obvious one. It's definitely still in supply chains deep down, hopefully not as much anymore in the later tiers in the finished goods factories, but it happens, but probably more of an issue further down the supply chain, where you have rural communities who really rely on the income coming from these children working. Then freedom of association, right to collective bargaining. So some countries, trade unions are free to operate. They are able to collectively raise workers' concerns. They can request increase in wages. It really helps workers have a voice. Similarly, collective bargaining agreements are in place in some countries, and that gives an extra level of protection to workers in terms of working hours, wages, etc. But there are some countries where trade unions are not free to operate. So often brands might look at this issue collectively, and they might work through their multi-stakeholder initiatives and really lobby governments to open up the legislation in that area. Health and safety, again, quite self-explanatory, so I'll leave that one. Living wages, we're going to come back to. So ultimately, minimum wages in most countries are a tiny percentage of what it actually costs to have afford all your basic needs, support your family, accommodation, your food each month. This is a big area of focus, and one of the more complicated ones because national legislation doesn't follow this living wage methodology. Then working hours, we will also come back to, because this can often be heavily impacted by the way we as brands order our products, how we communicate with suppliers, and again, national legislation. These all relate to regulation, but you can see kind of an overall, these are the things we are striving towards. These are the policies that organizations will have in place. They will be creating audit programs, often sending auditors to factories to check that all these standards are being followed. They're normally in line with the ILO convention. So the ILO is the International Labour Organization. It's a part of the UN, and they basically have set these conventions that countries should ratify. So they sign up to them, and then the countries should be implementing them. In reality, it's not always the case on the ground. And that tends to be why companies are going in and conducting audits. But I probably should mention that audits are not always the best way to identify an issue. That, you know, if a supplier knows an auditor is coming, they might hide some issues, that kind of thing. So there's lots of critique out there about audits and actually about how companies should be approaching this now, how they should be working with suppliers, because ultimately most suppliers are not bad people. They are under a lot of stress, a lot of time constraints, and yeah, they don't want to harm their workers. They do want to look after their workers most of the time. So it's about working with those suppliers. But I just wanted to touch on this because most brands, however big or small, will be following a code of conduct. like this.
Yes. And probably doing, the reality is, right, probably doing some level of audits today.
Yeah.
So this is kind of another key point, I think, just to quickly touch on, what do you see as the future of audits, knowing all the challenges that you just described at a high level with the auditing process that's been in place for basically the last 20 plus years since this topic really kind of became in the broader knowledge. What do you think? What's the evolution of that model?
I think ultimately, for now at least, there'll always be a reliance on some level of auditing, whether there are definitely more unannounced audits going on, so not allowing that preparation time for suppliers to maybe hide some of the information they don't want you to see. But I think generally people are moving towards more of a partnership methodology, also more of a sharing, because ultimately these suppliers might be doing 2 audits a week, more than that sometimes. So actually they're investing their time in preparing documentation, etc., showing people around the factory, when they could be investing their time into building the management systems to improve these areas. There's also a big focus now on tech and how we can hear from workers directly on a more regular basis, because audits again are just a snapshot in time. They're what happened on that day in that factory. But there's a big push for kind of all these worker voice technologies, worker surveys, etc., being rolled out. And originally people were skeptical because how willing are workers to voice their concerns in this way? They don't know who's on the other end of the phone. They might not be actually technically literate and be able to use all these apps and stuff like that. But I was on a webinar the other day where we're seeing that actually they are becoming more comfortable, and there's signs that they're raising concerns. The funny thing about social is sometimes the results look worse, but actually, it looks like it's getting worse, but in reality, workers are feeling comfortable to raise issues,
Yes.
which is a good thing.
It's actually because it's being raised to the surface. Yeah. I mean, I think we see that in environmental too. The more data we have, sometimes the worse things look, but it's actually more accurate. So
exactly.
Yeah.
If forced labor is going up, it means people are recognizing that they shouldn't be treated this way, or someone else shouldn't be treated this way. And that's ultimately a good thing. And you can try to resolve it.
Yeah.
So I think a big reliance on tech going forward as well. And this due diligence approach where you try and tackle the most serious issues first, perhaps. And there's lots of different methodologies around training and worker groups and this kind of thing. But ultimately, you need to, strengthen worker voice in order to hear solutions from people themselves as well.
Yeah. And the one other thing I would add on that too is that's a concept that we'll talk about a bit. We'll talk about it quite a lot actually on the environmental side as well. This idea of such a key piece of being able to implement environmental or social improvements in the supply chain is establishing those relationships between brands and their suppliers, their supplier partners. And in particular, the farther you go along the supply chain, where, as we talked about earlier, you may not in the past have had like a direct relationship with them or a direct contract with them, but how can we start to put more models in place where brands are working directly with their supplier partners farther down the supply chain and building that trust and relationship so that we're not reliant on a model of periodic audits that probably aren't accurately capturing really what's happening in many cases. So anyway, more to come on that. That'll be a key theme. Yeah.
But the issues are often more complicated than they seem as well. Like there's a reason, like I said, suppliers are for the most part not terrible people. And there's a reason behind any of the policies in place or processes going on. And so definitely building those relationships in person is vital to creating the solutions. And not just sticking a band-aid on it.
Yeah.
So I wanted to just quickly show you 3 photos from various trips I've done, but they pretty much sum up the reality, like how important context is to all of these issues. Like I said, there's always a reason behind something. So this photo is in Myanmar. This is a recruitment center in Myanmar, actually for international recruitment. So there's huge amounts of migration across the world. As we know, it's happening in Europe right now on a huge scale that we haven't seen in a long time. Workers often travel to earn a better wage, better future for their family. But as soon as you start to travel, these workers lose some of their power. So they're in environments that they're not used to. People are speaking languages they're not used to. They have a lack of adequate information about where they're going. All they know is they've been offered a job in another country and they are going to earn more money for their family. But these gentlemen on the left are recruitment agents. Back to the point when most people are not bad people. Most recruitment agents are not bad people. They're just trying to earn a living. But the fees that end up being charged to these workers can put them in a form of forced or bonded labor. So this is just one form of modern slavery, but probably the most prevalent in apparel, footwear, outdoor supply chains right now. This is a big concern because it's often very hidden. Like I said, these workers are just vulnerable. Ultimately, they want a better future and they're willing to do whatever they can for that. So they're a long way from home. Maybe their families or even their communities gave them some money to help pay their fees to get there. So they're already tied in before they've even got to the job that they're going to. So this is like really one of the most concerning cases because they're paying fees at every turn. They're paying fees for their passport, which is kind of fair enough. We all pay a fee for their passport. That one has to be paid, but they're also paying for their transport, for this recruitment fee, recruitment agents' transport, for their program. But the recruitment agent is also taking money at the other end. So they're getting money from a factory who don't necessarily know that workers are being charged fees, because also there's a big push now on the employer pays principle. There's a big push from brands that workers should not be paying for their jobs, because ultimately they then become tied in and it becomes forced labor. They are scared that if they leave, they won't be paid their salary, they won't be able to pay their debt. There's more obvious forms of forced labor as well. There might be state-sponsored labor in certain countries where the government is involved with moving groups of people to different jobs. Prison labor is another big issue. Even obvious things like workers' passports being taken away from them. But the real thing to consider is just the shift in power. As soon as a migrant worker is away from home, they lose their support network and everything they know. And it's very difficult to get really good information. So there are lots of NGOs working on the ground right now. The ILO has a big program called IRIS, which is focused on providing this information to workers. There's like lots of scoring systems of recruitment agents out there, but essentially there's like a economy behind moving workers around, which is very difficult to untangle. So this is a really complicated one. It's not good for brands at all. It's difficult to figure out. It's a huge amount of money behind it. So if you want your factory to repay recruitment fees, they build up very quickly. So that's a big cost to any supplier. And again, they're not usually bad people. They're just trying to make ends meet as well. And they're usually paying your recruitment agent. So just with any issue, it's important to take a minute to understand the context behind it. Because yeah, it's not as simple as just repaying fees and everything's solved. So that's just a point on forced labor. I don't know if you want to pick up on anything, Seth.
Nope, I would say keep going. Yep, a couple more key topics here.
A couple more. So this photo is obviously of a small boy. This is not a factory that supplied any brands I work with, I'm glad to say, but it was an informal workshop next door to another informal workshop in India. It's in the middle of the slums in India, in Mumbai. And really, I wanted to touch on living wage here because no person wants to send their child to work. Every parent would rather that their child was building that better future for their family, having an education, um, improving their outlook for their life. But the reality is, in so many countries, there are children supplementing the income of their families. This was a leather handbag factory. We think it was probably the domestic market as well. So it's important to remember that all these factories in the news as well are not necessarily supplying the multinational brands that we know, but there's huge domestic markets in many countries, China, India, especially, just because of the sheer amount of people. But the living wage discussion is very much at the moment seems to be of a reputational importance to brands. So there's pressure from civil society actors, but because legislation within countries is usually only around minimum wage, there's not a legal pressure on brands right now. But no one wants to see this image in their supply chain, near their supply chain. It's important that people are able to, feed their children, and they can work normal working hours. They can, support their livelihood. So it's a big, big focus right now, especially when there's lots of pressure once you compare the cost of a product to how much it's selling for versus how much the worker is getting at the beginning, because it's just a tiny percentage normally. And then this is the last image I wanted to show you. This is a dormitory in a Chinese factory. It's not a bad dormitory. The person seems to have their own room. It's quite light. They've got plenty of space for a dormitory. Obviously, it's probably not anywhere we'd want to stay. But what I really want to show you was this worker is probably not in this dormitory for a lot of the time. So excessive working hours are a big issue. And I wanted to relate it back to brands again, because often excessive working hours, there are other human rights issues as well, but it's quite easy to link the way brands purchase, order things, forecast their orders. There's a direct link between that and the pressure on factories to meet the deadlines, get the product in store, have the latest drops. Consumers have a want for newness that brands are eager to meet, and ultimately the pressure ends up falling on suppliers. So there are lots of initiatives right now focused on getting feedback from suppliers that often brands will hear, but they won't necessarily have to act on. But there's one obvious one is obviously the cost of product. Obviously, a supplier would like more money for the product they're making, but there's other things about really clear communication is very important. If material is going to be delayed, that can have a huge impact on how a supplier plans its workers' working hours, whether they have to work on the weekend. There's also small things like a supplier once told me that their major issue was the fact that the design, like the CAD, the design itself, was not sent electronically beforehand. So if it was sent electronically beforehand, they would have a week or so before anything arrived to plan, practice with their workforce, and really work out how the production was going to get out. But because they sent the design within the box itself, they lost that time. So lead times can have easier fixes. Not always, but there are small things people can do. And so there are the Better Buying Initiative, for example, has a huge survey for suppliers, and it goes into all these small things as well, not just the cost of product, but obviously suppliers would like more for their products, I'm sure. Those were the three major things I wanted to touch on, Beth.
Great. Yes. And I think we will probably wrap it up as we're approaching 45 minutes here, but I think this is just a fantastic overview. And I guess my last question for you would be for anyone who's sort of coming into this space and wanting to learn more about how the supply chain works and kind of what the key issues are. What do you feel like the key takeaways are here for students who are, either already in apparel businesses, but perhaps in a different function, or wanting to kind of get into whether it's environmental or social, or a broader holistic, strategic sustainability role.
Mhm.
What would you say the key takeaways are on this topic?
I think one of the most important ones is definitely having that traceability, because ultimately,
Hmm.
unless you know where your product's coming from, you can't respect or protect the workers in that supply chain. So without that, so many more things on the environmental side as well, of course, are impossible to tackle. So the importance of those supplier relationships and understanding the actor before that is really important. Um, and then the collaboration piece is very important, because even on a small scale, so often brands will work together if they're in the same factory. So that is actually one of the most powerful things you can do in a factory, is if you found an issue, you discuss it with a brand, you can see their products when you're there, they're working there. You don't have to have like a publicly listed supply chain to work together. And then on the national scales as well, that's important. And I think on the small scale, visiting suppliers, understanding issues, and speaking to workers, you never learn as much from any kind of reports as if you're on the ground. So it's just so important, those personal relationships, for sure.
Yeah, yes. Yeah. And I would echo that even from um, the supplier visits I've done. And, I haven't been as in such a direct role as you have in terms of, the amount of supplier visits I'm sure you've done, but those that I have done and been able to tag along with some brands when I was at Outdoor Industry Association and obviously in my role at VF Corporation, that is the most beneficial thing to really understand the on the ground context, the nuances, why policies that you may be thinking about may not make sense on the ground, how to
Mhm.
adjust things to, sort of meet in the middle on, what the business needs, but also making it as efficient and effective as possible for the workers on the ground and your supplier partners. So I would definitely echo that. It's by far the most useful thing that you can do as someone who works in the supply chain in any capacities, to go out and be able to
Definitely.
visit the workers on the ground. So thank you so much, Siobhan. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So happy to share it with you.